Good morning, and welcome to this morning's discussion on how the pandemic is reshaping the world, which is organized in the auspices of the Delphi Economic Forum 2020. My name is Maria Demertzis, and I am the Deputy Director at Bruegel, which is a Brussels-based economic think tank. And today I'm delighted to have as my guest Ivan Krastev. Welcome. Good morning, Ivan. Ivan is the chairman at the Center for Studies in Bulgaria, and I'm really delighted that we can today discuss some of the global trends that we are observing them. And if I may start, Ivan, the pandemic shock is in all senses of the world one of the biggest shock, if not the biggest shock that we've seen in a generation. And it really is going to change the world in a number of different ways. What were the trends in your view that were happening before the crisis, and how is this pandemic crisis going to change that?
Thank you very much. I very much agree with you that in a certain way, this is the biggest social experiment probably we're going to live through. It came as a shock. It was global. Over weeks, almost 2 billion people went home out of work. But it is important to see that this is not a classical disruption crisis. In a certain way, this crisis much more intensified certain type of trends that have been there before. For example, the new intensification, for example, in the US-China confrontation is very much visible, but it didn't come as a result of the pandemic. Pandemics simply speed up many processes that have been there before. Even certain level of deglobalization and the idea of the shortening of some global supply chain, it was there. So from this point of view, I do believe that this crisis is much more an amplifier than a classical disruption.
But do you think that it is actually going to be catalytic in the sense of change in direction? Or do you think that, once we've gone over the first shock, at some time we will have a vaccine, we're going to go back to business as usual?
Listen, business as usual is going to be very difficult for economic reasons that you know better than me. But even the story of the vaccine is interesting because we're talking as if the moment that when the vaccine is there, this is the end of the crisis. But probably you have seen the Pew Research survey showing that only 49% of the Americans said that if the vaccine is available, they're going to be ready to take it. Societies are so much divided on so many levels, and it's not only the United States, that even when you have a vaccine, imagine that half of the population decided that they're not going to use it. So we see a kind of, in my view, deeper change. And it is not simply that COVID-19 changed a lot of things. Also, COVID-19 allows us to see certain things that have been changed before, but we have been blind to them.
Yeah. But you mentioned the China-US conflict that was there before, but it's really amplified with the pandemic. Well, let's just stop here for a minute and understand what is this and how do you think that this will change, and effectively how it will also affect us. And by us, I mean Europe. There was the rise of China that has actually posed a challenge for the US in the sort of the global supremacy. This has really created turbulent currents in multilateralism. Do you think that there is a possibility of rescuing the multilateral system, a global rule book that is going to be something that we can all agree upon, and therefore we can, continue the process of globalization? Or do you think that this is not possible? China and the US is just too different, and therefore globalization is going to necessarily revert?
Listen, I don't believe that anything is impossible, but unfortunately, after these 2-3 months, we are less hopeful about effective multilateralism than we have been before, and for a very simple reason. Imagine that 6 months ago, we're going to be asked what the type of crisis can save globalization and really can convince different big powers, but also small powers, that we're living in a world in which we're so interdependent to each other that we need a global rules, we need a global cooperation. And obviously, war is not type of a crisis like this because the war is facing states against states, and this is not even a kind of a climate change, because climate change has all the characteristics for this, but the level of urgency is very different in different places. So people could speculate that a pandemic of the type of one which we see now probably is the best way to convince people and states to come with a global response and basically to re-establish a global cooperation. So from this point of view, I do believe one of the most devastating outcome of the crisis for the moment was that, particularly in the first 1 month, the major result of this pandemic was much more the rise of nationalism. Everybody went home. There was no real effort for global leadership. And from this point of view, both China and the United States failed the test. This is the first kind of a crisis in which the United States didn't take its usual role of a global leader. And China was much more trying to use the crisis either to promote its interest or to cover some of its failure in the beginning of the crisis, than really to try to help for this. And European Union did its best. I do believe the German initiative that after that became the European initiative with the vaccine is something to be celebrated. The question is, do you really can have an effective multilateralism when the two biggest world powers, United States and China, are not particularly interested in it?
Yeah. You sound a little sober when it comes to this. On the economic side, I mean, you could think of a world where things will cost more, and if that is what the global order wants, then so be it. But on issues like climate change, how can we ever resolve the problem of climate if there isn't international cooperation? I mean, that doesn't sound very good.
Totally. No, no, no. Listen, this is the story, and this is why, as I told you, pandemic is a problem on its own, but the failure to come with a coordinated response is a huge problem, because even if Europe is doing its best, even we manage to decarbonize in a radical way, this is not going to be enough to save the climate
That's right.
issue.
That's
You need China, you need United States, you need India. So from this point of view, we can only hope that this momentum of a dysfunctional global cooperation can also teach the member states about the limits of this type of nationalism. Because something like this we saw, for example, on the European level. In the first two
yeah.
weeks of the crisis, everybody went home, not only people, but also states. But the more the crisis have been developing, you also see the limits, particularly of economic nationalism. Because in the beginning, the closing of the borders gives certain type of a feeling of more self-confidence in the public. But then you understand how much we are dependent of people who are crossing our borders. It became clear how much, for example, German or Austrian economies are dependent on East European labor. So at the moment when everything was closed, you had these charter flights of Bulgarians and Romanians flying to Germany and Austria for the harvest of the asparaguses. And I do believe that this kind of a two phases of the crisis, in which the instinct to go home is strong not only among people, but also among states, was there. But then you understand that you cannot stay home all your life. And from this point of view, I do believe, by the way, that there is a major difference between the nationalism that was triggered by the refugee crisis and the nationalism that we see in this crisis. The nationalism triggered by the refugee crisis was an ethnic nationalism. It was about origin. This one is very much about residence. In a
Yeah.
certain way, Bulgarians were not particularly happy to see Bulgarians living abroad coming back in the beginning of the crisis, because they were afraid
Right.
that they can bring infection. At the same time, the countries were much more open and tried to integrate foreigners who basically were living in these countries, because social distancing works only when everybody is practicing it. And in the case of Portugal, in the day when they locked down, they declared that they're going to treat all migrants as if they're residents.
Yeah.
So from this point of view, this is much more territorial. It is much more inclusive. So just trying to say that the nationalism that we see during this crisis is the same that we have seen some years ago, I do believe is also wrong.
Yeah, let's start with Europe for a minute. And it's interesting what you say, that the first reaction was for everybody to go home, including the states. After that, however, once you overcome your first human reaction. Everybody understood that we need to coordinate. We need to go beyond that. The European Union has done, both at the national state but also as an institution, and is continuing to do a number of big things to try and actually deal with the aftermath of the crisis. Do you think that the pandemic shock is going to be sort of the excuse we needed to integrate more, or do you think that in 6 months from now, that the tendencies that we had before the pandemic will resurge?
No, listen, I do believe that European Union has a real chance for many reasons, and there is one important kind of a mistake not to be made. And the story is unlike in the global financial crisis. This time you cannot blame uh, the countries that were hurt most.
Yeah.
Moralizing is never a good idea anyway. But during the global financial crisis, the narrative was, oh, you have a problem in Greece, you have a problem in Italy, but they're responsible for this. You cannot say the Italians or Spaniards are responsible for what happened. This is a disease, and the virus is going everywhere. So part of the success of some of the governments doing better was also luck. It came later and so on. So from this point of view, the readiness to share is much more important. But I have been reading recently a survey that European Council on Foreign Relations did in 9 of the EU member states. Greece, unfortunately, is not one of them. And this is quite interesting to see several trends that should be taken care if we want to make this type of empowering of the European Union reality. The first is, as a result of this, the view of the national state very much varies in different countries and very much depends of how people believe that their country dealt with this crisis. After the COVID-19, now, at least on this stage, the Germans trust the German nation state of being able and capable of dealing with problems. This is not how the French or the Italians feel. By the way, the most kind of optimistic with the Swedes. I don't know how it's going to be now because the survey was done 2 weeks ago, but there was even a kind of a national pride that we did something that nobody else dared to do. But the second thing is that while the judgment and appreciations of the European institutions was not improved as a result of the crisis. And the explanation is also that on the healthcare part of the crisis, European Union is also quite irrelevant because this is very much in the domain of the national governments. At the same time, we see an increase in a demand for European cooperation, but, and this is the most important, not necessarily deeper European integration. Paradoxically, we do not see the Hamiltonian moment about which the German foreign minister was talking about. We see a moment in which publics are ready to support their governments if they decided to empower and strengthen Brussels, but not because they believe in federal Europe, but because they believe this is the only way to make their national state relevant. So for the first time, the clash is not between nationalists and pro-Europeans. Paradoxically, many nationalists start to understand that the wood which is going to be squeezed between the United States and China, the only way for the Europeans to have any say in the world is by empowering the European Union and basically having much more unified policies. At the same time, many classical internationalists, which have been putting all their faith before in globalization and in the multilateralism, start to believe that, of course, we still believe it. We cannot do it without Chinese and Russians. So we should have our insurance policy. And this insurance policy is going to be something as a progressive protectionism. If we basically others cannot agree with us what to do about climate change, then we're going to tax them and their goods, which are going to be produced in a way that is harming the nature when they enter the European market.
But if I understand it correctly, there is actually good news in the sense that if most Europeans actually believe that we need European solutions to such problems, this is surely a change in perceptions. Actually, I dare say that the European elections and participation in the European elections in May was a first indication that the European citizens were asking for much more of a European solution to a number of problems they were facing. And what you're saying is this is only strengthened now after the pandemic, even if there isn't much of a support for a federal solution, which is really a very big step in the way that we organize our societies in the context of Europe. Surely the fact that we want more federal solutions is a step in that direction, is it not?
Totally. No, no. Listen, in a certain way, what, for me at least, how I see it, as I told you, I am much more hopeful than in any other previous crisis that we can have a kind of a radical change. But in order for this to happen, it's very important for the European leaders, and I mean both in Brussels but also in the national capital, to get the narrative right.
Yeah.
And the narrative is that after this crisis, people had the feeling that the nation state matter because this is kind of in the moment of crisis, this is what you can rely on. They also understand the limits of what their nation states can achieve, particularly as an economic actor. And I do believe now it became clear to everybody. By the way, from this point of view, also Sweden is a very interesting example, and I have a huge respect for Sweden daring to do something that others were not doing. Because being a contrarian in a moment of a total uncertainty is something important. But the interesting story is they didn't lock their economy, but nevertheless, probably Sweden is going to have a deeper economic decline than some of the countries who did the total lockdown, which shows you how much interdependence is a reality. And nevertheless, of what government is going to decide on its own, this is not the most important. When everybody else is locking down, the fact that you don't do it does not matter. And I do believe this became to the people very much kind of a something that they realized. And secondly, we have a generation which for the first time realized that openness of the borders within the European Union should not be taken for granted. This was interesting to see the difference between my generation, which knows what the closed borders mean, and the younger people who said, for the first time, I cannot go home. For the first time, I realized that there is a border between, for example, Austria and the Czech Republic. And I do believe this is a very strong moment because normally people start to value something only at the moment when they're losing it. And there was this moment, there was this moment as a result of COVID-19 crisis. So as a result of it, yes, I do believe we have a chance. We should be hopeful. And if the politicians are going to make and to find the right language to justify their policies, it can work.
Ivan, I'm told that we have 3 minutes left in our disposal. But before we close, I'd like to ask you one question. In the global sense, how can Europe exert itself and achieve the welfare for its own people best? If you had the opportunity to decide and you would do one thing, what would you do to make sure that Europe can provide the better solutions for its own citizens?
Now, listen, one of the really interesting things is that, and here I'm very much where the majority of the Europeans are, Europe can benefit best if we're going to have a much more rules-based world in which we can function. And this is the world for which Europe is best prepared. And Europe is not a classical great power. But at this moment, Europe should basically have two options in the way how to react to the world, because not everything depends on us. It very much depends what is going to happen in the United States, and even not simply who is going to win the elections, but how basically America is going to find itself in this crisis. Very much depends basically about China, because we see a much more aggressive and ugly face of China during this crisis. So Europeans, I do believe, still should bet on a rule-based order, and we should have basically our regional version and kind of our self-defense if the world decide to go in a different directions. But I want to end on something that is important for me. After this crisis, everybody is saying in which direction the world will go. Listen, we are not in a 1989 moment in which at least we have the illusion that we know in which direction the world will go. Probably different parts of the world will go in a different directions. So there are going to be big changes, but they're going to be in different directions, and they're going to happen at the same time.
Listen, Ivan, thank you so much for this. I mean, I wish we had more time to go and discuss some of these issues. These are very big issues, no simple answers. I think you're quite optimistic on the way that the EU is progressing, and I know I share that view. I think there is more that we can achieve better if we do it in a much more coordinated way, not only in Europe, but also globally. The global trends are perhaps not the right ones for encouraging cooperation. I hope we get an opportunity to discuss this at some other occasion. But I think for the moment, I'm told that we have less than 1 minute to go. So let me take this opportunity to thank you for joining us, for joining the Delphi Economic Forum. And I hope that we will be able to meet in person and not in the distant future. For the moment, stay well, and thanks very much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Taxi.